At the age of 66, Steve Borden steps out from behind the curtain with a legacy that very few people in the history of American wrestling can touch. A career spanning nearly 4 decades, where the name Sting is not just a nickname, but a living icon of an entire era. He was once the central face of WCW, the one who kept the audience staying even as an entire television empire began to crumble, a multiple-time world champion, one of the rare performers who could make tens of thousands of fans rise to their feet just by appearing in silence. The Crow era took him beyond the boundaries of sports entertainment wrestling, turning Sting into an image of resistance, of solitary justice, of a man who didn't need words to be heard. He is one of the very few wrestlers respected in every locker room, from WCW, TNA, WBW, to AEW, a name synonymous with loyalty, discipline, and a rare professional ethic in an industry notorious for its brutality. Steve Borden's achievements aren't just in the championship belts or the roaring crowds, but in the fact that he was never caught up in scandals that shattered so many other careers, never betrayed the fans, and never turned himself into something he didn't believe in. But even as the spotlight of those accomplishments shines down, behind the familiar face paint lies a harsh reality that no title can cover. The hands that once squeezed opponents now tremble slightly when tying laces, the neck and back stiffen after thousands of accumulated falls over the years. Each morning waking up is a silent negotiation between pain and the will to keep going. Steve Borden knows full well that his body is no longer what it used to be, that every step onto the mat is a gamble with vertebrae that have been worn down, but he still stands there, still paints his face, still dons the persona the fans love, not because he still needs to win, but because he hasn't allowed himself to quit. The pain doesn't make him bitter, doesn't make him resentful, it becomes part of his life discipline, something he accepts as the final price of perseverance. In the silence before stepping out, Steve Borden isn't thinking about glory, he's thinking about taking one more step, enduring one more time, because throughout his life he has never been measured by what he gained, but by the number of times he kept moving forward when his body was begging him to stop. If you want to continue following the untold story of the price Steve Borden paid for the legend named Sting, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part. Thank you for staying until the very end, and we'll see you in the next installment, where the silent pains behind the spotlight begin to emerge. If the later part of Steve Borden's life is remembered by the audience through the lights, the music and the iconic face paint, then the roots of the man himself were formed in a completely different space, quiet, private, and devoid of encouragement. His childhood had no beatings, no visible violence, no loud tragedies to make outsiders gasp in pity, but that very absence of emotion left a lingering wound deeper than any blow. In the home where Steve grew up, everything was orderly, disciplined, and proper, but also cold in a way a child couldn't name. No one yelled in his face that he was useless, but rarely did anyone stop to say he had done well, that he was seen, that he was important enough to notice. Praise didn't exist, hugs were rare, and silence became the most familiar language in the family. Steve learned very early that if he wanted to survive in that space, the safest way wasn't to demand or rebel, but to endure in silence and keep moving forward. At school, he wasn't the kid who got bullied, but he was never the center of anything either. Not stand out, not celebrated, not hated. Steve existed like a shadow, always present but rarely remembered. When friends were praised for sports or academic achievements, Steve stood on the sidelines, watching and absorbing an invisible lesson. The world doesn't owe you recognition, and if you wait for it, you'll wait a very long time. Instead of rebelling, he learned to endure. Instead of asking why not me, he told himself, just keep going. It was in those seemingly calm years that a unique character gradually formed, not from confidence or self-belief, but from a quiet will that refused to let him fall. Steve didn't cry, didn't rebel, didn't seek attention, because he understood early that those actions brought no change. The only thing he could control was his ability to continue, even when no one was paying attention. He played sports not for applause, but to feel his body still existed. He threw himself into training, not to prove anything to others, but to fill the void that silence left behind. Every drop of sweat was a self-reminder that he was still moving forward, even if no one was cheering from the sidelines. Those years didn't create an outstanding child, but they created a man with extraordinary endurance, accustomed to walking alone without complaint. When failure came, Steve didn't collapse, because failure was just another form of silence he had long been familiar with. When pain appeared, he didn't complain, because from childhood, he had learned that pain isn't always heard. That foundation shaped Steve Borden before wrestling entered his life, a man who didn't seek pity, didn't demand understanding, just quietly accumulated endurance like a survival instinct. Later, when audiences saw Sting rise after heavy falls, enduring matches beyond safe limits, they often called it warrior spirit, the resilience of a legend. But few knew that endurance wasn't born in the ring, it was forged much earlier, in the quiet rooms of childhood, where Steve Borden learned to survive by a simple but brutal rule: don't complain, don't expect comfort, just keep going, because no one else will do it for you. When Steve Borden finally stepped into the world of professional wrestling, it wasn't the moment a childhood dream came true. It was more like a soldier arriving on the battlefield, when the war had already dragged on too long, and others had already claimed their positions. He joined wrestling later than most of his generation, when many opponents already had foundations from their teens, already accustomed to collisions, to pain, to the harsh rhythm of the ring from very early on. Steve entered that battle with a clear disadvantage. Time was not on his side. In the training room, he quickly felt the scrutinizing looks, the silent comparisons, and the unspoken doubts. He wasn't a natural talent, not a face expected to become the next star. He was just someone who arrived late, having to prove he deserved to stay. That feeling of being behind didn't make Steve rebel or quit, because from childhood he was used to not being favored, but it pushed him into a brutal choice. If he couldn't go faster than others, he had to go longer. If he couldn't be protected, he had to endure more himself. Steve trained with intensity beyond normal, extending sessions when others had stopped, pushing his body to limits he hadn't yet fully grasped the consequences of. Every training session wasn't just skill building, it was a bargain with himself that if he hurt a little more today, maybe tomorrow he wouldn't be eliminated. In the ring he accepted heavier matches, more brutal impacts, because he understood that someone who arrived late couldn't afford to ask for kid gloves. While colleagues were protected to preserve their futures, Steve chose to prove himself with his own body, as if every bruise, every fall was a temporary ticket, allowing him to keep existing in the game. The comparisons never stopped. There was always someone younger, faster, more agile, and Steve heard them in silence, not through direct criticism, but through missed opportunities, fleeting glances, indifferent nods. He understood clearly that he didn't have the privilege of youth, and so every passing day carried an invisible pressure. If he didn't do enough today, tomorrow there might be no place left for him. It was during this period that Steve's body began speaking in subtle but persistent ways. Small pains appeared and vanished, joints stiffened in the mornings, bruises that didn't heal fast enough were layered over by new ones, but he didn't see them as warning signs, because from the start he had entered wrestling with the mindset that pain was a given, the price to pay for arriving late. Instead of listening to his body, Steve learned to ignore it, treating the pains as part of the process, something he could endure if he wanted to keep moving forward. The early years of his career weren't marked by brilliant spotlight moments, but by slow erosion, when every training session, every match left small traces that at the time no one, not even Steve himself, was alert enough to realize would accumulate into a much heavier burden later. But in those moments, all he saw was the road ahead, and the fear of being left behind. And that fear was strong enough to make him accept paying a higher price than others without a single complaint. Steve Borden didn't enter wrestling with the innocence of a young person believing their body was invincible. He entered with the mindset of someone long accustomed to endurance, ready to use his own health as collateral for a fragile opportunity. That very choice, the choice to fight harder to compensate for arriving late, laid the first bricks for the tragedy that came later, when his body began carrying the consequences of years where pain wasn't something to stop for, but something to push through to avoid being forgotten. Success came to Steve Borden faster than even he had ever imagined. And when the name Sting began to echo through the arenas, It wasn't a release from the years of having to prove himself, it was the beginning of a far harsher phase, where fame brought no mercy. Sting rose to fame quickly, so quickly that he barely had time to adjust to his new role. From someone always afraid of being left behind to the face the audience expected to see every single night. Wrestling doesn't let new stars rest, and for Sting fame meant a suffocatingly packed schedule, constant travel, restless nights of half-sleep, and mornings waking up with a body that hadn't had time to recover. Every time he stepped out onto the mat, he could feel the weight of the audience's expectant eyes, the eyes of people wanting to see the icon they loved, not the tired, aching human behind it. In that world, injury was rarely seen as a reason to stop. It was just a little thing, an inevitable part of the job, and people expected you to keep going as if nothing had happened. Steve quickly learned an unspoken rule: if you stop for too long, your spot won't wait for you. The pains in his neck, back, and shoulders started showing up more often, but they were pushed down under the pressure to show up, to maintain the image, to prove he deserved the trust he'd only just earned. Every time he even thought about complaining, it came with the fear that he'd be seen as weak, as not tough enough for the role he now held. So Steve learned to swallow the pain, not because he didn't feel it, but because he understood that admitting it could make everything he'd just built vanish as fast as it had arrived. Wrestling demanded constant sacrifice, and Sting became someone willing to pay the price with his own body to hold on to a position he'd won too late. He entered every match with the mindset of someone who couldn't afford to make a mistake, because someone who arrived late and rose fast was always scrutinized more closely, judged more harshly, and never granted the patience that younger stars usually got. The grueling schedule left him no chance to listen to his body, and even when the pains lasted longer than usual, he still told himself he just needed to get through one more night, one more week, and then everything would be fine. But fine in that world never came, because every success brought more responsibility, more expectations, more matches. Sting wasn't just carrying himself, he was carrying the image of a rising star who couldn't disappear from the spotlight for even a moment. Those around him could see the rise, the applause, the recognition, but few saw how he returned backstage, quietly unwrapping the tape, feeling every joint screaming after impacts the audience called entertainment. Steve gradually understood that fame in wrestling didn't come with protection, it only raised the price you had to pay to keep it. He wasn't taught how to protect his body, he was quietly encouraged to keep going, because the system always operated on the principle that the one willing to endure more would last longer. And since he'd been used to enduring since childhood, Steve didn't push back against that logic, he accepted it as a natural part of the path he'd chosen. Early success left him no time to set boundaries, to say no, to realize that some pains shouldn't be brushed off, and it was during this phase that the first cracks began to form in his body, quietly but persistently. Sting learned to smile in public, to step out with confidence, while inside he was in constant negotiation with himself. Just endure a little longer, just don't let anyone see you weaken, and everything would still be under control. But that was an illusion only time would expose, because every time he swallowed the pain to keep his spot, his body recorded another debt, one he'd later repay with years of incomplete recovery. Fame without mercy wasn't just the period when Sting became a big name, it was when he began learning to survive in a world where fame protected no one, and where holding on to your position sometimes mattered more than holding on to yourself, a costly lesson Steve Borden accepted very early, and would carry for the rest of his life. The birth of the Crow wasn't just a turning point in Steve Borden's career, it was the moment the persona swallowed the person, when Sting stopped being merely a wrestler and became an icon. The entire industry lifted up as a living legend. The black and white face paint, the long coat, the suffocating silence before stepping out, created an image so powerful that audiences rose to their feet just to watch him exist. And in that moment, the Crow was celebrated as a masterpiece of modern wrestling art. Silence became his brand, no words needed, no explanations, just presence enough to dominate the space. And Steve Borden understood that he had created something very few could, a persona that transcended the real man. But from the very instant the Crow was praised as an immortal icon, An invisible prison began closing around him. Silence was no longer a choice, it became an obligation. The darkness was no longer a style, it became the standard. And the man behind the paint was no longer allowed to show fatigue, doubt, or weakness. Every time he stepped out as the Crow, Steve wasn't just carrying the audience's expectations, he was shouldering the pressure to keep that icon from ever crumbling. He wasn't allowed to age in front of the public, wasn't allowed to slow down, wasn't allowed to let anyone see that his body was paying the price for all those years of swallowing pain. The Crow doesn't complain, the Crow doesn't back down, and the Crow doesn't stop even as inside, the real Steve Borden began feeling the daily wear and tear. That silent persona made him more and more isolated, because no one checks in on an icon, they only admire it. Backstage, when the face paint was washed off, Steve faced the familiar pains in his neck and back, the accumulated exhaustion he couldn't share, because sharing meant breaking the image millions were trusting in. The Crow was built as a rebel, a lone figure standing against betrayal and falsehood, but ironically, that very persona forced Steve to betray his deeply human need to rest, to weaken, to stop when necessary. Every match in the Crow era was iconic, every fall was seen by the audience as part of a grand story, but for Steve, it was another painful milestone etched into his body, another sign that the price of greatness kept rising. He knew full well that if the Crow lost its majesty, if the silence was broken by even a moment of hesitation or fatigue, the entire legend could collapse faster than any fall. So he kept locking himself inside that persona, telling himself that if he could just hold it together a little longer, one more chapter, everything would be okay. But time doesn't side with a man imprisoned in his own role. While the audience hailed the Crow as immortal, Steve felt more clearly than ever the limits of his body, the stiffness in his joints, the pains that lingered longer after matches, and no longer faded like before. He wasn't allowed to age normally, because aging in the Crow's silence meant losing symbolic power. He wasn't allowed to be weak, because weakness betrayed the image of the lone warrior, and he wasn't allowed to stop, because stopping meant admitting the icon had limits. The Crow, the thing that had once saved his career and lifted him to the top, gradually became a mask he couldn't remove, a prison where Steve Borden had to live alongside his own image, while the real man was pushed further into the shadows. Those around him saw a quiet, mysterious, resolute Sting, but few realized that silence wasn't just a stage strategy, it was the only way he could hide the exhaustion, and the fear that if he ever missed a beat, it would all end. In the Crow era, Steve Borden wasn't just fighting opponents in the ring, he was fighting time, his body, and the very persona he'd created, a battle with no cheers and no clear victory. Every time the audience rose to honor the Crow, Steve stepped deeper into the prison of his own greatness, where he had to keep straining to prevent the icon from collapsing, even if the price was the freedom of the man behind the paint. And in that prolonged silence, one truth slowly became clear, even if unspoken. The Crow wasn't just the peak of Steve Borden's career, it was also the gilded cage that locked him in a role he no longer had the right to leave, where he was forced to exist as an unchanging legend, while his body and soul quietly cried out, not allowed to weaken, not allowed to age, and absolutely not allowed to stop. When the Crow era lifted Steve Borden to the peak of icon status, it was also the moment the world around him began to crack in ways no face paint could hide, and the greatest tragedy of his life didn't come from a single fall or a specific injury, but from a quiet choice called loyalty. While others saw the signs of WCW's collapse and prepared their exit, Steve stayed, not because he didn't see the storm coming, but because he didn't know how to leave a place that had given him identity and purpose. WCW wasn't just a workplace, it was the space where he grew up, where the Sting persona was born, where audiences learned to believe in the Crow's silence, and for Steve leaving at that moment would have been no different from betraying the very story he'd spent his life building. He didn't chase power, didn't join backstage deals, didn't try to position himself safer as the wheels of history started turning backward, because loyalty to him wasn't a strategy, it was a life principle. In an industry where survival often meant picking the right side and the right moment, Steve chose to stay with what he believed was right, even if it meant standing on a ship slowly sinking. When WCW fell, it wasn't just the end of a company, It was the disintegration of an entire world that had shaped who he was, and Steve stood there watching history turn the page with no room for him in the new chapters. The people who'd stood beside him left, new faces emerged. The industry moved on at a speed loyalty couldn't match. In that moment, Steve Borden wasn't pushed out by a loud decision, he was left behind in silence, when what he represented no longer fit the new logic of modern wrestling. Loyalty, once celebrated as a rare quality, gradually became a burden weighing on his shoulders, because it brought no power, opened no new doors, and didn't spare him the feeling of being forgotten. Steve didn't turn bitter, didn't attack, didn't speak out to blame, because he'd long been used to enduring in silence, but this silence carried a different weight, heavier than any physical pain. As history wrote on without him, Steve had to face a brutal truth. Loyalty isn't always rewarded, and sometimes it just keeps you in a story that's already over too long. He watched opportunities pass by, new stages form without a place for the persona he'd sacrificed his real self to preserve, and in those quiet gaps, the question began to echo, not to the audience, but to himself, was this loyalty worth it? But Steve didn't change, because changing then would have made all the years before meaningless, and he preferred being left behind over denying the path he'd chosen. Loyalty became an anchor, slowing him down as the world sped up, but it was also what kept him from drifting into compromises he didn't believe in. In that tragedy, Steve Borden didn't lose his honor, but he lost his position, lost the chance to step into new chapters of the industry as a leader. When WCW vanished, what remained for him wasn't power or influence, but memories, beautiful but painful, because they reminded him there was once a time when loyalty was enough, and then suddenly, it wasn't what the world needed anymore. Steve kept walking, carrying the weight of someone who'd chosen to stand still while history moved on, and the price of that choice wasn't measured in money or titles, but in the feeling of being left behind, the feeling that even after giving everything, he still had to face a world that wouldn't wait alone. Steve Borden's tragedy of loyalty wasn't that he chose wrong, it was that he chose right by his own values in an era with no room left for those values, and that cut deeper than any fall, because it couldn't be bandaged, couldn't be healed, only carried in silence as part of who he was, the man who stayed when everything collapsed and accepted paying for that loyalty with his own place in history. After the wave called WCW receded, leaving Steve Borden standing silently amid the wreckage of his loyalty, his tragedy didn't end. It simply shifted to a crueler, quieter form, where the enemy was no longer history or the system, but the body that had been worn down for far too long. The pains began to show more clearly, not as vague aches that could be ignored with adrenaline or crowd roars, but as persistent repeating signals, as if his body was trying to say something Steve didn't want to hear. Neck pain became a familiar companion every morning, the ache not immediately fierce, but enough to make him pause a few seconds in front of the mirror, trying to turn his head left then right, realizing movements that once felt natural were now frighteningly difficult. His fingers sometimes went numb, feeling like they no longer fully belonged to him, and there were brief moments of lost balance, just a misstep, a second of staggering, but enough to plant a fear in his mind he'd never had to face before. Steve knew exactly what those signs meant, because throughout his career, he'd seen colleagues forced to stop by similar warnings, but knowing and accepting are two completely different things. Each morning waking with a stiff neck, Steve didn't ask himself if he should stop, he asked how to push through the pain fast enough to still make it to the ring that night. It wasn't the stubbornness of youth anymore, it was a habit etched deep into how he existed. Pain wasn't a reason to stop, it was just an obstacle to overcome. Doctors, advice, worried looks appeared more often, but they were drowned out by a much greater fear, the fear that if he stopped, if he let his body rest, the world would move on without him, and the name Sting would slowly become a distant memory. Stopping meant disappearing, and for someone who'd already been left behind when history turned the page, that thought was scarier than any physical pain. So Steve kept stepping into the ring, even when every step had to be calculated more carefully, even when bending down to tie his boots sent a sharp reminder through his neck. He learned to adjust, to hide, to smile and step into the lights as if everything was still fine, because the audience didn't come to see a man afraid of his own ability to turn his head. they came to see an icon. But in private moments, with no lights or music, Steve faced a reality harder to deny. His body was betraying him, not with a sudden collapse, but with hundreds of small signals ignored over the years. Training sessions grew heavier, not because intensity increased, but because recovery had clearly declined, and every fall left a lingering sensation longer than before. Steve began living in constant vigilance, afraid of a slip, afraid of an off-timed collision, afraid of the moment his limbs no longer obeyed. But that fear didn't make him stop, it only made him quieter, more cautious, and more determined not to let anyone see how fragile the edge had become. Wrestling, once the place he found identity, now became a constant test of his endurance, and each time he got through a match without major incident, Steve told himself he could still go a little longer. But that little longer stretched from year to year, while the pains never disappeared, they just changed shape, sometimes dull, sometimes sharp, sometimes turning into a constant worry that something inside was slowly slipping out of control. Steve wouldn't let himself call it betrayal, because naming it that way meant admitting the limit had arrived, and he wasn't ready to face that truth. Instead, he kept negotiating with his body, promising that just one more chapter, one more appearance, and then he'd listen, but each new chapter opened before the old one could close. In Steve Borden's world, where loyalty once left him behind, stopping wasn't rest, it was accepting disappearance, and so even as his body began begging to stop, he chose to keep going, carrying the pain as part of the price for keeping the name Sting from fading into oblivion. This isn't the glorification of pain, it's the tragedy of a man who'd lived in silence too long, to the point that when his body spoke up, he knew nothing else but to ignore it, and continue, because all his life he'd been taught that survival mattered more than safety, and that sometimes, to not disappear, you have to accept paying the price with whatever is left of yourself. When the warnings from his body could no longer be completely ignored, Steve Borden fell into a deeper mental crisis than any injury he'd ever endured in the ring. Because this time the opponent wasn't standing in front of him, couldn't be locked in a hold, couldn't be slammed down, but existed inside him like an ever-widening void. The mornings waking up with a stiff neck and numb hands didn't just bring physical pain, they dragged along a more terrifying question: if this body really stops, what will be left of him? Wrestling had become his identity, the place where he learned to survive, and when the ability to continue was threatened, Steve realized he was standing at another edge, the edge of emptiness, where there were no lights, no cheers, no face paint to hide the fear. He began to feel tired in a way rest couldn't fix, a tiredness of the mind, where stepping out to the mat no longer brought relief, but only a new negotiation with constant worry. In that period, Steve didn't turn to faith as a miracle or a promise of salvation, because he was too grounded to believe something could erase what his body had already endured. He turned to it as a last lifeline, not to be pulled to safe shores, but simply to keep from sinking completely in the waves of despair and bitterness. Faith came to him quietly, undramatically, just like the way he'd lived his whole life, in the moments he sat alone, and realized that if he kept facing pain with nothing but raw endurance, he would soon become someone even he wouldn't recognize. Along with that search came the decision to quit alcohol, not because it had destroyed him in the sensational way the public often sees with other legends, but because Steve realized it only dulled the pain temporarily, only for it to return heavier the next day. That quitting wasn't announced, wasn't celebrated. It was just a silent step back from habits that had once helped him escape the feeling of helplessness. With no more alcohol to numb the pain, Steve was forced to face it fully awake, and it was in that wakefulness that he began learning a much harder lesson: to endure pain without letting it turn him bitter. Faith didn't make the pain disappear, but it gave him a different frame of reference, where pain was no longer an insult or injustice to resent, but part of a journey he could choose how to meet. Steve learned to slow down in his thinking, to accept that some limits couldn't be overcome by willpower alone, and that acknowledging fragility didn't mean failure. In those months, he didn't become lighter, but he became calmer, and that calm was what saved him from slipping deep into the resentment so many others fell into when their bodies betrayed them. Faith helped Steve ask not "why is this happening to me," but "who will I become when this happens?" and that question slowly changed how he saw himself. He no longer measured his worth only by how much longer he could compete or endure pain, but by how he kept his kindness, his humility, and his ability not to let pain turn him into someone who hated the world. In the silence of evenings without lights, Steve began to feel that surviving wasn't just about stepping back into the ring, it was about protecting the human part inside from being eroded by disappointment and fear. Faith for him wasn't a promise of a happy ending, it was the strength to endure the present without losing himself, a lifeline keeping him afloat when he no longer had the energy to swim, and it was in that despair, when every familiar solution no longer worked, that Steve Borden learned to carry pain like an unwilling companion, not clinging to it, not denying it, but letting it exist beside him at a safe enough distance, so he could keep living, keep moving forward, and keep his soul from hardening, even when his body was no longer whole as before. When Steve Borden found that spiritual anchor to keep from being overwhelmed by pain and fear, he also began to see more clearly another truth that weighed heavily on his heart. The truth that throughout all those years under the bright lights, his family had always been in the background, quietly, patiently, and accepting the darkness the public never saw. Family wasn't on the posters, didn't step to the ring with him, wasn't cheered in victory moments, but they were the ones directly bearing the cost of the packed schedules, the endless travel, and a man who always had to prioritize the persona over presence. Steve wasn't an uncaring husband or father in a cruel sense, but he was a man frequently absent, both physically and emotionally, because even at home, his mind was still stuck in the locker room, in pains that hadn't faded, in worries about what the next match would take from an already exhausted body. Family moments passing without him became so normal that no one blamed him anymore, but that very silence made the guilt grow over time. Steve missed ordinary evenings he could have been home for, missed small but important milestones, moments that could never come back, and every time he returned, he felt more like a guest than a full part of family life. Wrestling gave him identity and purpose, but it also took away his ability to live fully for the people who loved him most, and that was a price no title could ever repay. Steve was fully aware of what he'd missed, and that awareness didn't come in one dramatic moment. It built up slowly over the years, through each realization that there were gaps in family memories he couldn't fill with apologies or late regret. That remorse wasn't loud, wasn't explosive, it quietly followed him, like the dull aches in his body, always there even when unspoken. Family for Steve wasn't a place of complete healing, because some breaks had formed too long ago, but they were the final boundary keeping him from collapsing when everything else became fragile. When the lights went out and the cheers faded, it was family where he could return without needing to be strong, without needing to be an icon, just a man trying to stand steady. But even in those moments, Steve still carried the feeling that he'd arrived too late, that there were roles he could only live partially, never as fully as he wanted. Family didn't blame him for the long absences, but that forgiveness only made him feel more indebted, because he understood their love came with silent sacrifices no one could demand repayment for. In the quiet of private life, Steve began facing the most painful question: were the years he traded for his career truly worth what his family had to endure? He had no clear answer, because denying the path he'd taken would mean denying who he was. But looking straight at the losses, he also couldn't pretend everything was fine. Family kept him standing when his body betrayed him, and the world changed, but they couldn't fully heal what was broken, couldn't bring back moments that had passed, and couldn't erase the feeling that he'd lived parts of his life more for the audience than for the people closest to him. That truth made family love both warm and painful, because it reminded Steve that no matter how well he endured in the ring, there were losses that couldn't be repaid by toughness, and that sometimes the greatest tragedy isn't what people lose in public, but what quietly slips away behind the lights, where no cheer is loud enough to drown out the unfixable regret of a man who gave his whole life to a promise his family never asked for. After all those years of enduring in silence, after the pains that were brushed off, the mornings with a stiff neck still stepping into the lights, the greatest physical tragedy of Steve Borden finally arrived, not loud, not announced, and more cruel than anything he had ever imagined. That night at WWE, everything unfolded like hundreds of other nights in his career: bright lights, familiar music, the audience rising to welcome a legend they believed was still untouchable. Steve stepped to the mat with instincts honed over decades, his body still obeying what his mind commanded, even though deep inside, the warnings had appeared long ago. No one in the stands knew how fragile his body truly was, and Steve himself wouldn't allow himself to think about it, because thinking about it meant admitting he might no longer control the game. The moment of injury didn't resemble the brutal falls he'd endured before. It wasn't a dramatic accident that silenced the entire arena. It was a seemingly ordinary collision, a very small mistimed moment, but enough to shatter the delicate balance his body had struggled to maintain for years. When Steve went down to the mat, for one very brief second he waited for the familiar sensation of pain spreading, the kind he could grit his teeth through, and then stand back up. But what came next was completely different. It wasn't pain, it was a terrifying emptiness. When he tried to move and realized his limbs no longer responded as before, as if they no longer belonged to him. In that instant, all the noise around him seemed to vanish, the lights faded, and for the first time in his life, Steve Borden didn't know what to do next. He lay there, not as an icon, but as a man facing the most primal human fear, the fear of losing control over his own body. As doctors and medical staff rushed in, Steve couldn't clearly hear what they were saying, but he saw in their eyes something he'd never seen in his entire career: not the usual urgency, but a tense caution, as if one wrong movement could lead to an irreversible outcome. On the stretcher, as he was carried out of the ring in silence, Steve felt more clearly than ever the fragility of his body, the truth that just one more moment, one different angle, one stronger impact, and he might never have gotten up again. In the emergency room, when the doctors spoke about his cervical spine, about the risk of spinal cord injury, about the possibility of permanent paralysis, Steve heard those words like a foreign language, because all his life, he'd lived as if those things only happened to other people. This was the first time he understood that the warnings from his body were no longer whispers he could ignore, they were the final cry for help. The hours lying motionless in the hospital bed stretched on endlessly, and in that stillness, Steve faced thoughts he'd avoided for years. What if he never stepped to the mat again? What if he lost the ability to move? What if everything ended here? What would he be without wrestling? The fear of permanent paralysis wasn't just about losing the ability to walk, it was about losing identity, losing the thing that had defined him since he was a young man arriving late to the fight. When the doctor said he was lucky, that just a little more, and everything could have been very different, Steve didn't feel the relief he thought he would, because lucky in that moment carried a bitter meaning. He had come razor close to the absolute limit his body could endure. In the days that followed, as sensation gradually returned, as he could move his limbs again with extreme caution, Steve didn't celebrate, because he understood he hadn't escaped danger, he'd only been given more time. His cervical spine had suffered serious damage, and any further fall, any further mistake, could be the last one. There would be no second chance for luck to be on his side. For the first time in his career, Steve Borden was forced to confront head-on the truth he'd always dodged. This body was no longer an infinite tool for him to keep fulfilling his promise to the audience. Every movement now came with fear. Every thought of returning to the ring was overshadowed by the image of himself lying motionless, unable to feel his limbs, the lights above becoming distant. In the silence of the hospital room, Steve understood that the boundary had been drawn very clearly, not by time or career, but by his own life. One more fall, and it was over, not as exaggeration, but as a cold reality confirmed by science, and the painful experience he'd just endured. And in that moment, with no lights, no audience, just a man facing the possibility of losing everything in an instant, Steve Borden felt for the first time a fear greater than being forgotten, the fear that if he continued, the price might no longer be pain, but the rest of his life locked in permanent immobility. This was no longer a story of loyalty or resilience, it was a life or death moment that forced him to look straight at his human limits, where no face paint could shield him, and where courage was no longer measured by standing up after a fall, but by admitting that some falls must never be allowed to happen again. After the night his neck nearly ended everything, Steve Borden didn't return to wrestling like a survivor who just escaped disaster. He returned as someone carrying a constant fear that clung to every breath. Training sessions after the injury were no longer places to sharpen strength or reflexes. They became tense dialogues between will and worry, where every movement was done more slowly, more carefully, always accompanied by the silent question of whether this body could still be trusted. Steve entered the training room with a crystal-clear memory of the moment his limbs stopped responding, and that memory didn't fade with time. It stayed there like a warning light, always on in his mind, turning every once natural movement into one laced with hesitation. He trained in fear, not fear of defeat or criticism, but fear that his body would betray him at the exact moment it couldn't be undone. Fear that the tiniest misalignment could send him back to the stretcher, or worse, never let him stand again. The body, once a loyal ally throughout his career, now became an unknown variable, no longer responding unconditionally to the commands of his will, and that loss of trust gnawed at Steve day after day. Every sharp pain in his neck or back made him flinch. Every slight numbness in his hands was enough to make his heart race, because he knew exactly how thin the line he was walking had become. When stepping to the mat, the familiar thrill no longer arrived intact. Instead, there was a constant mental calculation of risk, of angles, of impact force, of the chance of landing wrong. Every walk into the lights was a gamble, where the reward was no longer victory or cheers, but simply leaving the ring on his own 2 feet. Wrestling, once the place Steve found freedom and identity, now turned into a persistent obsession, because it was tied to the image of the next fall, the fall that might offer no chance to correct. He began to see the ring with different eyes, not as the stage of an icon, but as a space where everything could collapse in a single moment. Nights before matches, Steve slept less, not from excitement, but because his mind kept replaying the moment of immobility on the mat, the lights above fading, and the helplessness of being unable to command his body. Even when he successfully completed a sequence in practice, the sense of security lasted only briefly, because he knew today's stability didn't guarantee tomorrow's. That fear didn't make Steve quit immediately, but it completely changed his relationship with wrestling, turning it from a passion into an unending psychological test. He no longer stepped to the mat with the certainty of someone in total control, but with the vigilance of someone who knew every mistake could be the last. Wrestling was no longer the escape from everyday fears, it became the very source of fear, and that made every appearance heavier than before. Steve tried to maintain composure in front of the public, because the persona wouldn't allow him to admit the anxiety, but inside, he lived in prolonged tension, where joy was overshadowed by the responsibility to simply survive. There were moments he wondered whether continuing was still admirable resilience, or had become dangerous stubbornness, but that question was always pushed back by the greater fear that if he stopped, wrestling would leave him forever, and all the years of sacrifice would lose meaning. That very inner conflict turned every training day and every ring appearance into an internal battle, where Steve wasn't just fighting the opponent in front of him, but also the image of himself lying motionless, a reminder that never left, that the final boundary was very close. In that state, wrestling was no longer joy, no longer release, it was a constant haunting, a shadow that followed Steve Borden step by step, making him understand that from now on, every fall wasn't just part of the job, it was a life or death question he had to face every time he chose to step back into the lights. After all those months living in fear of the next fall, when every training session felt like a silent gamble with fate, Steve Borden still made a decision that even those who understood him best could not easily accept. He returned to the ring, even though deep down he knew very clearly that it was something he shouldn't do. That decision didn't come from impulsiveness or illusions of titles, because at this stage of his career, Steve had nothing left to prove, no peaks left unclimbed. It came from a different fear, quiet, but more persistent than even the fear of permanent paralysis, the fear of being forgotten. For someone who'd spent his entire life refusing to disappear, from the boy who joined wrestling late, from the loyal one left behind when history turned the page, leaving in silence meant accepting that everything he'd endured could vanish faster than the cheers that once rang out for him. Steve understood that the era had changed, that new faces kept appearing, and that wrestling always moved forward without looking back, but he couldn't bear the thought of becoming a name mentioned only as a distant, extravagant memory of a bygone time. So he chose to come back, not with the confidence of old, but with an almost obsessive caution, every step to the mat carrying the feeling that he was going against the clearest warnings his body had ever given. The matches became shorter, the moves more restrained, but even in that caution, his body still paid an additional price. The neck pains returned faster, more fiercely, as if reminding him that resilience couldn't erase decades of accumulated damage. Steve didn't return to chase louder cheers or greater glory moments. He returned only to affirm that he still existed, that the name Sting hadn't been crossed out of the present. But every time he stepped down from the mat, he carried an extra layer of exhaustion, an irreversible wear, and the mornings after matches became heavier trials than the match the night before. His body no longer recovered like it used to, and what once could be overcome with a single deep night's sleep now stretched into days of pain and worry. Steve was fully aware he was trading the future for the present, but in his mind, that future had grown faint compared to the obsession to keep showing up. He didn't want to be remembered as someone who vanished out of fear, even though in reality, he lived in fear every single day. Wrestling in this phase was no longer a pure choice, it was a psychological tether, where continuing became the only way to keep meaning in all the years of sacrifice. But the price of refusing to disappear was very real, and very harsh. Every landing carried risk, every collision could be the last, and Steve stepped to the mat fully aware he was walking a fragile tightrope between existence and ending. There were moments he wondered if he was betraying the very lesson pain had taught him, but then he continued, because stopping demanded an acceptance he wasn't ready to give himself. His body kept sending signals, aches, numbness, prolonged fatigue, and each one was a new debt recorded in the ledger of his life. Steve didn't boast about this endurance, didn't turn it into legend, he just carried it quietly, because in his world, existence always came before safety. The decision to return when he shouldn't didn't make him greater, but it exposed the deepest tragedy of a man who'd lived too long with the fear of being left behind. His body paid more, not as punishment, but as the inevitable consequence of extending a journey that had already gone too far. And in every heavy step on the mat, Steve Borden understood he was no longer fighting to win, he was fighting to delay the moment he had to face the most painful truth, that sometimes refusing to disappear can cost you more than what you ever feared losing. The final years of Steve Borden on the ring weren't marked by scorecards or roaring applause, but by a different, quieter, more cruel count, the count of pain. Every match he entered carried the vague feeling that this could be the last, not because of a script or plan, but because his body had reached an unpredictable threshold. No one backstage dared say it out loud, no one in the stands thought about it, but Steve knew very clearly, because every time he tied his gloves, every time he stepped through the ropes, he felt the fragility hanging over him. The final matches weren't prepared with excitement, but with a near-prayer caution, praying every collision happened at the right angle, the right force, praying his body wouldn't betray him at the critical moment. Steve stepped to the mat, knowing he wasn't competing to win anymore, he was competing to survive that night, to leave the ring on his own feet, instead of being carried out on a stretcher. The falls that once were a familiar part of the job, now carried the scent of ending, not the scent of defeat, but the scent of possibly never standing again. Every landing he listened to his body more than to the cheers, wondering if the feeling in his neck, back, arms and legs was still intact. No one knew which match would truly be the last, and that uncertainty made everything heavier, because Steve had no moment for a full goodbye, no clear period at the end of a lifelong journey. Every time he returned backstage after a match, he didn't sigh in relief because he'd won, he sighed because he could still feel his body, could still stand steady, could still live one more day. Wrestling in this phase was no longer a confrontation between two people on the mat, it was a confrontation between Steve and his own limits, where the only victory was not letting disaster happen. The accumulated pains grew thicker, not as separate aches he could name, but as a constant background pain, clinging to every movement, every breath. Steve began distinguishing matches not by memories of beautiful spots, but by the level of pain afterward, which one kept him awake longer, which one made turning his neck harder the next morning. Every match that passed without major incident was a silent victory, but also one step closer to the final limit, because he understood his body couldn't keep paying forever without demanding something back. In those moments standing on the mat, looking out at the crowd, Steve sometimes wondered if the people cheering knew what they were witnessing, that behind the paint and the unyielding persona was a man counting every ache to keep the name Sting from disappearing. But he didn't resent the audience, because they were the reason he kept going, kept stepping out even knowing every collision could be the last. The final matches carried a sad beauty, where resilience was no longer measured by strength or speed, but by the ability to endure in silence, by completing the match without letting fear show. Steve didn't seek victory in those matches. Victory had become a luxury concept. He sought wholeness, the feeling that he could still control his fate just a little longer. But even in that fragile control, he clearly felt time wasn't on his side, that every step to the mat consumed something that could never be restored. The final matches became a series of days where the line between courage and recklessness grew ever blurrier, where Steve had to ask himself if he was honoring his career or just prolonging pain because he couldn't face the end. There were no glorious moments marking this phase, no belt raised high, no echoing victory declaration, just a man stepping to the mat, doing what he'd done his whole life, and praying his body would allow him to leave one more time. In every collision, Steve heard the whisper of the end, not as a threat, but as a reminder that every journey has a stopping point, no matter how hard one tries to delay it. And in that silence, when there were no more victories to celebrate, only survival to be grateful for, the final matches of Steve Borden became the most painful climax of the story, where value wasn't in who won or lost, but in how far one man had gone to keep his promise to the audience, even when the price was pieces of his own body. When the final matches closed without a clear exclamation point, Steve Borden stepped into age 66, with a colder reality than any cheer that had ever surrounded him. This body would never fully recover. Not in the dramatic sense of a collapse, but slowly, persistently, relentlessly, where every passing day brought small but unyielding reminders that what was lost wouldn't return. Mornings began with dull aches in his neck and back, not fierce enough to drop him, but enough to turn simple movements into careful calculations. Turning his head, bending over, standing up from a chair, things once automatic now required consideration, because one careless motion could flare the pain, dragging it through the whole day. Wrestling was no longer there to absorb or mask those sensations. The ring had gone, the lights had dimmed, but the pain stayed. It remained, no audience needed, no soundtrack required, existing in the absolute silence of everyday life. Steve realized a bitter paradox. When he was still competing, pain had purpose, had context, had reason to be accepted. But now, without wrestling, pain became raw and meaningless, not justified by any victory, not soothed by any cheers. There were days he woke up feeling as though he'd just gone through a match that lasted all night, even though the night before he'd just sat quietly in a silent room. His body seemed not to understand the fight was over. It still reacted as though every day was a new round, where old injuries automatically spoke up. Steve learned to live with it, not by denial, but by a sorrowful acceptance that full recovery was no longer an option. The dull pains creep into the most ordinary moments of daily life, when he walks slowly, when he sits too long, when he tries to sleep but can't find any position that's truly comfortable. At night, with no distractions left, his body speaks more clearly, and Steve faces a truth that's hard to put into words. He paid for his future to make the present last just a little longer. No one witnesses those sleepless nights. No one applauds when he successfully rolls over without a sharp stab in his neck. No one knows that waking up each morning, still able to stand, is a small victory. This is pain without an audience, without praise, without a script or a clear endpoint. At the age of 66, Steve no longer has to prove anything to the world, but he still has to face himself every day, with a body that carried too much, and now has only enough strength left to exist. Wrestling was once the place where he learned to endure, and now that lesson follows him into post-career life, where endurance is no longer celebrated. He learns to slow down, not because he wants to, but because there is no other choice. New habits form not to improve, but to avoid making things worse, to avoid sudden movements, to avoid small risks, even to avoid memories that might tempt him to try something his body no longer allows. In that silence, Steve understands that the greatest tragedy isn't the absence of wrestling, It's that wrestling left while the pain stayed. There is no farewell ceremony for these pains, no tribute video, no perfectly closed chapter. They simply exist, day after day, as a reminder that some debts time cannot erase. And even without lights or cheers, Steve keeps living, carrying that unrecovered body with a quiet, sorrowful calm. Because if there is one thing he learned throughout his entire life, it's how to endure in silence, even when no one is watching, and even when the only reward is waking up one more day with the familiar pain still there, but not yet big enough to take away everything he has left. When every chapter of his career had closed, when the lights went out and the music no longer played to call his name, Steve Borden's story didn't end with a miracle or a late redemption. It ended with a quiet, cruel reality. He endured, and the world moved on. There was no reversal of fate, no day when his body suddenly recovered as if never worn down, no promise that what was lost would be returned. Wrestling moved forward with new faces, faster paces, younger bodies, while Steve remained with himself, with a body that paid the price in place of millions of audience memories. No one turned their back on him with malice. The world simply did what it always does, kept moving, kept searching for new icons, while old icons quietly faded into the background, along with injuries that would never be listed on any scorecard. Steve doesn't resent that, because all his life he understood that cheers are momentary, while the price paid is forever. At the age of 66, he lives in a slower rhythm, where each day is measured by how well he can manage the pain rather than by plans or ambitions. No more wrestling to dull the pain with adrenaline, no more audience to turn endurance into legend, just a man facing a body that no longer belongs to him the way it once did. He wakes up, feels the limits clearly, and learns to respect them, not because he wants to, but because he has to, in order to survive. There is no salvation here, because salvation implies everything will be fixed, while Steve's reality is learning to live with what cannot be repaired. There is a special kind of sadness in knowing that the greatest sacrifices of your life will never be fully seen. The audience remembers the glorious moments, the iconic appearances, but they don't see the aching mornings, the sleepless nights, the carefully calculated movements to avoid a pain flare-up. The world doesn't stop to acknowledge that, because it wasn't designed to, and it is in that unintentional indifference that Steve Borden's tragedy reaches its absolute peak, not because he was completely forgotten, but because what he endured the most happened in complete silence. Steve remains, not as a winner, not as a victim, but as a living witness to the real price of resilience. He has no miracle to tell, no promise that everything will be okay, just the truth that some people go so far, there is no way back, and they keep living, not for glory, but because it's the only thing left. His body never returns what it took, no flexibility, no sense of safety, no carefree feeling from years that never knew fear. And Steve accepts it, not with bitterness, but with a quiet, sorrowful calm, as if he has long been used to carrying heavy loads without anyone watching. The message he leaves isn't in words, it's in that very existence. A world that loves to honor the loud, the ones who dominate the spotlight, rarely stops to see those who endured in silence. Steve Borden doesn't demand applause for his painful years, doesn't ask for pity for an unrecovered body. He simply keeps living, as he always has, carrying the consequences of choices he made willingly. And perhaps right there in the uncredited silence, his greatness shines clearest. Some men are remembered for how loud they were, others should be honored for how much they endured without asking for applause. The story of Steve Borden doesn't just make people sad, it leaves a lingering ache that's very hard to name, because this isn't the tragedy of a sudden collapse, but the tragedy of a lifetime of slow erosion. Throughout the story, from the moment he joined wrestling late and had to train harder, fight through more pain to be acknowledged, to becoming the Crow icon, but being imprisoned by that very persona, Steve always chose to endure rather than complain. Details like ignoring his neck pain, continuing to step into the ring despite numb hands and lost balance, or the moment lying motionless after the neck injury at WWE, unable to feel his limbs, show that the price of resilience can sometimes be life itself. Even more heartbreaking is that when wrestling ended, the pain did not end with it. At the age of 66, He lives with a body that will never recover, dull pains every morning, no lights, no audience, and no reason left for that pain to be celebrated. Family keeps him steady, but cannot mend what is broken, just as faith helped him survive mentally, but could not erase the physical consequences. For American audiences, this story is a bitter reminder that society often celebrates results, victories, and glamour, but rarely sees the price behind them. From Steve Borden, we learn that resilience doesn't always lead to full reward, and that in real life, listening to your body's limits, valuing family, and daring to stop at the right time, is sometimes more important than trying to exist just to avoid being forgotten. This isn't just the story of a wrestling legend, it's a profound lesson about the real price of enduring in silence, in a world that always moves forward. If the story of Steve Borden left you silent and reflecting on the price behind greatness, please subscribe to the channel to continue joining us on journeys that have never been fully told. Thank you for staying until the very last minute, and we'll see you in the next video, where we keep listening to stories written in silent endurance, not just in victory.